Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gurudo King reading issue number 6 of volume 2 of the Unsearchable Riches. This is the third part in the series, The Secret Economy. And I guess the 6th or 7th part overall total, if we're counting the Divine Mysteries from volume 1. So, in the last one, I believe we covered the fact that the nations are joint members of the body of Christ. Now, in this one, they're covering that we are also, in addition to that, we are joint partakers of the promise. If I can pull up Ephesians 3, I can point out joint enjoyers of an allotment. I believe that was the first portion. Joint body, the second portion, and joint partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus is the third part. So there's 3 different aspects here to this secret. And now we're going to cover the third aspect. Okay. With that said, let's dive on in. The secret economy, item number 3, joint partakers of the promise. Physical barriers. Wherefore, remember that once you, the nations from the physical standpoint, who are termed the uncircumcision, in deference to those termed the circumcision, which is made by hands in flesh, that in that era you were apart from Christ, being in a state of alienation as regards Israelitish citizenship, and guests of the promised covenants, having thus no prospect and without a God in that order of things. Remember, for a little while, let us go back to the time before the secret economy was revealed. It will form a background upon which to view the present grace. The various points God charges us to remember are all dependent on physical descent. The rite of circumcision placed an impassable boundary between Israel and the nations. If we wish to obtain a clear and unconfused insight into these matters, it is absolutely imperative to dismiss every spiritual consideration and consider that we are dealing only with the physical place the nations were entitled to in relation to Israel. For instance, in mentioning the basic distinction of circumcision, which gave a name by which to call both parties, God is explicit in limiting the circumcision spoken of to that which men's hands had done in their bodies. There is no reference to spiritual circumcision. That natural condition of mankind is not circumcision. It is only in, yeah, that's actually a great point. Yeah, it is only in deference to circumcision and its attendant privileges that the negative and disparaging name of uncircumcision arose. Yeah, I almost want to comment on it, but I would sound silly and crass. But usually, the idea that we're chopping the tip of our sword off there doesn't exactly, it by no means is that from another person's perspective supposed to look honorable or good or right. Sure, all those old nations looked at them and were like, what the hell? How would you chop that thing? And yet when they start losing wars, they're like, oh my God. So the disparaging name of uncircumcision arises. And that's how it would feel on the surface from the perspective of a Jew. It would be an easy task for the Ephesians and others to whom this epistle came to recollect matters in which they themselves had been vitally concerned. They could look back to their own experience. Not so with us. We cannot recall these things. They never formed a part of our past history. They describe a dispensation long past and gone, which preceded the present, which is the subject of the latter half of the book of Acts and is concerned with the gospel of God, as dealt out by Paul in his personal ministry among the nations. But it is urgent for our understanding of the present grace that we, like them, compare and contrast the present superlative favor with the mercy previously shown to the nations. How shall we accomplish this? In this way. Let us put ourselves in their place for a while and thus rehearse some of their experiences in the period before they received this letter. As it is hard to imagine ourselves in the place of a class, it will be better to take some pattern case and trace his experiences as God had reported them in his word. But what shall guide our choice of such a one? We need not choose at all, for God has already chosen one and marked him for this very purpose. This man is Trophimus, which means nourished. His companion in travels, Tychicus, fortunate, delivered this letter to the Ephesians. Along with him is a runaway slave called Onesimus, profitable. We shall call them by their English names, so that we may seize their significance, for Greek to us is barbarous. In these three men, God has given us a living and moving panorama of the inauguration of the present order of things. Each name, together with every detail recorded of them, where they are, what they do, what befalls them, is filled with meaning. The history of these three men forms a picture in miniature of God's dealings in their day. If we associate each with such a knowledge of God and his ways as had been revealed, and rigidly exclude and deny to each things not recorded of them, and those revelations which were yet future, we shall enjoy an engaging and instructive picture of the inception of the present dispensation. Nourished, Trophimus brings before us the economy intervening between the present and Pentecostal dispensation. The things we are bidden to remember. His presence in Jerusalem with Paul, whom we will call Interval, as his name really is it means cease, for if you want to get fun with it, pause. Interval, as his name really is the touchstone which will apprise us of the real nature of that economy and the large place given the physical supremacy of Israel. Fortunate, Tychicus, the bearer of this message to the Ephesians, is a true picture of those to whom he was sent. While nourished is left behind through lack of nourishment, 2 Timothy 4:20, such as the force of sick, Tychicus is fortunate indeed. He leaves the past economy and enters the present. He knows the experience of nourish, but to him it becomes but a memory in light of the amazing favor afterwards revealed. And profitable, Onesimus, was like us. He had no personal experience in a previous dispensation. He was the fruit of Interval's bonds. Like the nations of whom he was a member, he had, in times past, been unprofitable. The nations were not on terms with God, but that could never wipe out the debt they owed him or destroy the fact that they were his property. They were his slaves. But they had left his service and become like a runaway slave to their great master. How strange that a man in chains should catch the runaway and return him to his master. And yet, this is God's way with us. Paul's chains, born for the nation's sake, has transformed many an unprofitable slave into one who is profitable indeed. Philemon 1:19. First, let us consider the nourished case. Let us go to the house of remembrancer, Nason, an early disciple, where Paul and his company are lodged after his last journey to Jerusalem. And there we will be nourished. Acts 21:16. I haven't read Book of Acts in a while. I think the last time I read through this book all the way through this part, because I've been heavily studying Romans, as you know, for longtime followers. So I don't. This is like it strikes my memory, but honestly, Acts like 21 through 28. I haven't studied hardcore for a while. Maybe one of these days I'll give it a look through. I think I'm also really looking forward to the H.W. Martin study on it, which will help us get into this. But yeah, it'll help us get into the joint partakers of the promise in the long run. He's getting there. The uncircumcision. All Jerusalem is in an uproar. The chiliarch is hurrying to the scene with soldiers and centurions. As he comes upon the center of the disturbance, he finds the mob seeking to kill a man, a Jew, after they had drawn him out of the temple and shut the gates. When he had seized and chained the man, he demanded whom he was and what he had done. Had he been an alien, it would have been a clear case of going beyond the soreg. But this man was evidently a Jew. The crowd was so vociferous in their denunciations that he could not find out what was really the matter, and so commanded him to be brought to the castle. As the Jew is about to enter the castle, he obtains leave to speak to the people. As the speech is in the Hebrew dialect, the tumult is hushed, and they listen attentively. But at length, he speaks one word which breaks the spell. Once more they cry, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." And as they cry, they strip off their clothes, ready to stone him and throw dust into the air. Oh, that seems like a great first step. We're going to stone him, so let's get naked. What? The object of their hatred is taken into the castle and disappears from our view. Acts 21, verses 27 to 22, 24. What is the cause of all this disturbance? The report is that he has brought an alien into the sacred precincts of the temple and defiled that whole place. Since this foreigner is in the city, he must needs hear of the riot and that he is the cause of it. Acts 21, verses 28 and 29. Nourished is not only his name, but it describes him too. He is not a Jew, though staying in Jerusalem. So while not a citizen, he is nourished on Jewish food and Jewish lodgings. For the time he sojourns there as their guest. His name and physical environment are but a parable of his spiritual state. Perhaps he had no part at all in the city's tumult of that day, but in his spirit there must have been a great disturbance. Some points in that day's doings stood out in bold relief. Nourished must have felt himself to be the cause of the uproar, for was it not brought about by the false rumor that Paul had brought him beyond the court of the nations, inside the middle wall of the temple enclosure, called the Soreg, where none but those of Jewish blood had a right to go? And the only ground for it was that some Jews from Asia had recognized him in Paul's company on the streets of the city. That was how it started. But how did it end? What was that horrid word that broke the spell the apostle seemed to have cast over the angry mob? Alas, it was the hated Goyim, as they called all non-Jewish nationalities. They could bear to hear of his conversion. They could even bear to hear their own stubborn rejection of God's message brought home to them. But to have God send him to the other nations, heathens, curs, uncircumcised, this was far beyond endurance. And the man who dared voice such a thought, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. Little did the mob of the faithful know how God would yet use these words to describe his purposes for Paul. No one would be as free as Paul to acknowledge that his life had been forfeited, but little did they dream that he would be induced, taken from the earth, to inherit heavenly honors. Man, the language God uses, it turns out to be dramatic irony. Like, wow. And that's how God does it in our lives too. I know it. And you know it if you've got that conversation in spirit with him. One of the first dates that I went on here, moving into College Station, Texas, with to be with my girlfriend, we went to a beautiful restaurant called 1860 Italia. 1860. I'm sure that name itself has some kind of meaning too, because all is because of us. 2 Corinthians 4:16, but that's besides the point. Maybe 4:15 or something. The fascinating thing about that is that now I am working at the sister property for that restaurant, as is she. So it is quite literally this dramatic irony, this foreshadowing that is set up beforehand, that I end up here. Also, after moving here, one of the first time New Year's came around, me and her, we went to Houston and we went to Pluckers for the first time together, which is a very famous uh, like wing stop here, I guess, in Texas. And me and her started working at Pluckers in August, 8 months later, uh, because it was one of the only options available for starting in the restaurant industry here. So yeah, it's just really fascinating the little things God does and pushes us, follows us around. I just love that sort of thing. Um, so I love being able to see when I see it because of that experience I'm having in real life. I look at the text and yeah, this is a very easy um like I 100% believe this to be dramatic irony. Mankind doesn't even know the half of it. I don't even know the half of it. I was lucky to be able to see it in choice of job, let alone here in the text. I'd never seen this before, but now I mean this is so pretty. How must poor nourished have felt at the thoughts these scenes compelled. He was nothing but one of the despised Goyim. As such, he knows his place, far, far below that God had given Israel's sons. He had sad proof of this today, when even a report that he had presumed to come as near to him as they, to go beyond the Soreg, had precipitated all this tumult. This great contrast between himself and the circumcision was accentuated by his presence in Jerusalem. In his journey with Paul among the nations, no such stress had been laid upon the ordinance which he now found made such a difference. True, Paul had circumcised God's worthy, Timothy, but his mother was a Jewess. Nurse had no right to the ordinance or the privileges it conferred. Uncircumcision meant nothing in most countries, or was not that the natural state of man. It was only when he had come in contact with the circumcision and in condescension to them that he must acknowledge that he belonged to a lower state or caste, the uncircumcision. But then, were there not scores of godly, devoted men in his native city who lived better lives than these circumcised Israelites? This could not be denied. Still, it was true that they came of the wrong stock. The great thing then was to reckon the patriarchs among your ancestors. If you are not a descendant of Abraham, you are not entitled to the right of circumcision and must keep your distance from God, from, from, from his God. And that's not a very well constructed sentence, but I'm not going to give him too much crap. You get 500 sentences right, and then you get a sentence wrong. It's whatever. Apart from Christ. And it was to these that Christ came. He was a servant of the circumcision for the sake of God's truth. Romans 15:8. Remembrancer, Nason, still don't know how to say that, was an early disciple and can tell us how the master himself acted towards the other nations. Certain it was he never set foot outside the promised land. In the church of his day, there were no Goyim, Gentiles. Indeed, when he explains to them how to shun a brother who refused to hear the church, he bids them treat him as they did the tax gatherers and aliens, Matthew 18:17. Traitors and non-Jews were equally excluded and condemned. He came to take up the cause of Abraham's seed, Hebrews 2:16. The woman of Canaan had to learn this humbling lesson. Have mercy on me, O Master, son of beloved David. Did not touch a single chord in that responsive heart. His disciples hear, but do they sympathize? Strange sympathy they gave. Send her away, they say. And he seems to acquiesce in this harsh demand. I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He was the true beloved who tended his father's sheep, but the woman was not of his fold. He was owner or master of all. And when she came worshiping and saying, Master, help me, he seemed to relent a little, but answered, It is not proper to take the children's food and throw it to the puppies. Matthew 15, verses 22 to 28. And how did she get the blessing? By taking her true place for him, by acknowledging Israel's prior, almost exclusive place, and by admitting that he was her master and she his slave. This was the only platform upon which blessing could be dispensed to uncircumcised aliens. She said, Yes, master, for even the puppies eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. No link bound her to Messiah, but her master he certainly was. Guests of the covenant promises. So he was not only the servant of the circumcision, but also gave the other nations occasion to glorify God for his mercy. Romans 15:9. This mercy was dispensed by him in the character of their master, owner, or proprietor, for he is Lord of all. This was the ground that stone, Peter, proposed to Cornelius, and the basis upon which he was baptized. Acts 10, verses 36 and 48. The Messiah, in his earthly glories, was the exclusive expectation of Israel. The nations had no part in him. Our ancestral tree may be most glorious and full of famous names, but unless it leads back to Abraham's grandson, supplanter, Jacob, or rather, as God named him afterward, God's prince, Israel, we are outside his covenant. We lack the one essential which entitles them to Jehovah's promises, which, when fulfilled, will make them the most blessed and exalted nation that this earth has ever seen. Aliens. But we are aliens. We cannot point back to one man, God's prince, Israel, as they could, and produce our genealogy to prove our claim. Just as all humankind can point back to the first man, Adam, as their common progenitor, so all these united on one man in their claims to his kingdom and blessing. And yet aliens, like the woman of Canaan, like Cornelius, like Knoch, had a superfluous crumb. The nations were guests of God's prince, and had a right, by Jehovah's mercy, to glean in their fields and vineyards and olive orchards. The crop is God's prince's, the redundance was for the nations. Even now, as we are in the city of their Messiah, the dwelling place of peace, Jerusalem, we partake of the food and lodgings which Remembrancer has so kindly provided. As we view the city and the temple on Moriah's Mount, we cannot but muse upon God's wonderful promises to his people and the part this holy city has had in these promises. Rightly, it is named the dwelling place of peace, though that day's doings were far from peaceful. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem, and he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift sword up against nation, and neither shall they learn war any more. Isaiah 2, verses 3 and 4. Hope. But what hope is there for the nations? He will judge and rebuke them. Sore indeed will be the day for the nations when Jehovah, God of God's prince, shall alone be exalted. Now they can boast in Roman worldwide dominion. Since Nebuchadnezzar's reign through the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and Greek and Roman dynasties, they have had their turn at ruling, or misruling, the earth with God's prince as a vessel. What is the outlook for the future? Will they keep the upper hand forever? The prophet who foretold their career has also foretold their final overthrow. Their kingdom shall be utterly destroyed, and the sovereignty of the earth will pass over to Messiah and his people, God's prince, as we should always think of Israel, that we do not always name the nation so. They are the royal nation in whose hand hope or expectation has placed the sovereignty of this earth. There is nothing for the other nations but subjection. without a god. By far, the most interesting and impressive sight in all Jerusalem was the temple on Moriah's hill. The outward face, in its front, wanted nothing that was likely to excite or either admiration or astonishment, for it was all covered over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the rising of the sun reflected a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it turn their eyes away, as they would have done at the sun's rays. It appears at a distance like a great mountain covered with snow, but those parts of it that were not gilt were exceeding white. After entering the city, our chiefest wish would be to get a close glimpse. And so we enter the gate through the outer wall into the court of nations and admire the cloisters with their polished marble pillars and the cedar roof. Beyond this, we tread an open space with polished and laid stones. As we approach the second court with its high wall, we see that it is surrounded by a lower wall of elegant construction. Upon it stand pillars at equal distance from one another, declaring the law of purity, some in Greek, some in Roman letters. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. This is like Mathena. Allogene. Yeah. But I don't know like what these are saying. I guess this is it. No alien. Oh, I see. I get it. Is to enter within the balustrade and embankment around the sacred place. Whoever is caught will be responsible for his death, which will ensue. This is the soreg which they thought nourished had passed with Paul. True, nourished had never transgressed this middle wall of the temple enclosure, but what comfort is there in that? If Jehovah, the one true and living God, dwells within those walls, why are we shut out? Why must we keep our distance? Nourished, in his Ephesian home, dwelt in the city which was the temple keeper of the goddess Artemis, whom the Romans called Diana, whose worship had spread over the face of the whole earth. Acts 19:27. Perhaps he too had once worshipped at her shrine, but now he had turned from all false divinities to serve the only true and living God. And now, at last, he is in the city which kept his temple, and he is denied access by God himself. Truly, he had no God to call his very own, since he cannot but acknowledge Israel's God, Jehovah. This little asterisk. Where is this asterisk? Oh, it's right there. I just totally skipped past it. Josephus, after describing the court of nations, says, thus was the first enclosure, in the midst of which, and not far from it, was the second, to be gone up to by a few steps. This was encompassed by a stone wall for a partition with an inscription, which forbade any foreigner go in under pain of death. Yeah. You cross that line, that's it. Truly, he had no God to call his very own, since he cannot but acknowledge Israel's God, Jehovah. In the world. Such is a true picture of the case of the alien nations in that system of things, even when they turned to God and acknowledged his Messiah and received his Spirit. Nor will the closest scrutiny of the sacred records discover any better thing in store for them unless we wait the far off day when this earth shall be dissolved and a new creation takes its place. Revelation 21:3. Then indeed God will dwell with the nations, but not, so far as Revelation goes, until that time. Nourished's fate. The nurture nourished got from Israel's crumbs became scantier as time went by. Jerusalem was herself sore stricken with a famine, Acts 11, verses 27 through 29. Follows Paul for a little way, but is left at Miletum, sick from lack of nourishment, 2 Timothy 4:20. Fit picture of the waning weakness of the economy, which fails with Israel's failure. But fortunate accompanies Paul all the way to Rome, Colossians 4:7. Oh, I'm not gonna lie. That was probably not my favorite article, but I can see its value in highlighting the necessity for knowing the uncircumcision's place. I mean, it's just such an important thing, or you can't even really get the value in Ephesians 3. So yeah, um, it's just as important in learning what the secret economy is as anything else. So not my favorite, but certainly critical. That's going to be it for me, though. I've got not much left to add here on that front. I will catch y'all in the next one. We will look into the beginning of a study. I believe it's by Vladimir Gleznov, titled The Gospel of Matthew. And that will be the beginning of a study literally on the book of Matthew. So I look forward to that. I've never read this study before, but I know they're starting to figure out the concordant stuff by this point. So that'll be really interesting. Okay, grace and peace to you all.